Hardy fan since I was 5 years old, which takes me back to 1964. And in those days, on Los Angeles television, they would show Laurel and Hardy short subjects every weekday. They'd show them in the morning at 7 o'clock and at 5 o'clock at night. So I got to see them as I was getting ready for school and after I came home from school. And it wasn't too long before I got to see and be very familiar with a lot of their work, even at a very, very young age. And just became enamored with them and wanted to know more about these movies, because I knew even then that these films were about 30 years old or so. And I remember being about 6 years old one morning in the kitchen of our home and prattling on about Laurel and Hardy as I usually was as I was getting ready for school. And I happened to say, gee, I wonder if Laurel or Hardy are still alive, because I didn't know anything about their lives at that point. And as soon as I said that, my dad brought in the Los Angeles Times, and there on the front page it said, Stan Laurel, 74, film comedian, dies at home. And it was such a shock, because I had just said, gee, I wonder if Laurel or Hardy are still alive, and boom, there was my answer. So that might have engendered a desire in me to want to find out about the making of these films from whoever was still around. And so when I was 12 years old, I found out about a great organization called Sons of the Desert. We may have some Sons of the Desert here with us tonight. Oh yeah, I got a few. Well, this is the Laurel and Hardy Appreciation Society, and it started in 1965. It's been going for 52 years now. And there are chapters or tents all over the world. It's still thriving and pretty active online too. And I found out that there was one in Los Angeles called the Way Out West tent. Every chapter or tent is named after a Laurel and Hardy film. So I wrote to the lady who was the secretary, and even though I was 12 years old and you were supposed to be 16 in order to get into the club, she bent the rules and let me in. And God bless her for doing that, because at that point there were a lot of people just coming to their meetings who had worked with Laurel and Hardy at the Hal Roach Studios. They were just coming as members. And so I got to meet them, and I started doing impromptu interviews with them with my little reel-to-reel tape recorder. And when I turned 16 and got my driver's license, then I could really go from my home in Buena Park to Studio City and Tarzana and North Hollywood and all these places where they all seem to live, and do formal interviews with them. And ultimately, I interviewed about 65 people who worked with Laurel and Hardy at the Hal Roach Studios. And so I got a really, really good perspective. I still have all those tapes too, so and they still play. So it's quite a wealth of information that I acquired. Also was able to see almost all of the original scripts, all of which have scenes which did not wind up in the finished film. So those are fascinating to see. So all that material wound up in the book. We're going to see 5 short films with Laurel and Hardy, all of which were produced by a man named Hal Roach. And Hal Roach also produced Our Gang, or The Little Rascals, for the TV generation. He also produced many, many movies with Harold Lloyd, who will be here in The Freshman before long. Charlie Chase was another Hal Roach star, and so he was a very enterprising young man. He had been a truck driver and a cowboy, and when he was about 20 years old, he got into the movie business because they needed cowboys for westerns, and he found out that being a movie cowboy paid a lot more than being a real cowboy. So he decided to be a movie cowboy. And within 2 years' time, he had his own production company. He was a producer at the age of 22. Starting in 1919, he had his own studio in Culver City at 8822 Washington Boulevard. That was there from 1919 until the early 60s. And primarily he made short comedy films. Back in the 1920s and 30s, they would show a short comedy before the feature picture as a little maybe appetizer before the feature film. And that's what he made. He was an independent producer, and he released his films primarily through Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. And Laurel and Hardy became his biggest stars. It's kind of interesting that every other comedy team in movies came from another medium. They came from burlesque or vaudeville or Broadway, and so when they finally started making movies, they had their characters and most of their best routines already established. But Laurel and Hardy didn't. You get to see them start their partnership on film. Stan Laurel was from a town in England called Ulverston. He'd been in music halls and in American vaudeville, and in the early 20s he was trying to make a go of it as a movie comedian. Oliver Hardy was from a little town in Georgia called Harlem, and had made hundreds of films in Jacksonville, Florida, which was a burgeoning movie community in the late teens. And in 1925 he was signed by Hal Roach just as a contract player. So here they both were working at the Hal Roach Studios, and they were just actors in the same film. But over the first 20 films that they appeared in together, you get to see them develop this rapport with each other and create their characters and their established mannerisms. So it's fun to get to see the team sort of create itself on film. This first one we're going to see is called "You're Darn Tootin'," and it was great that we heard the Exposition Park rag, because the first scene in this movie was actually shot at Exposition Park. They used to have a band shell there, and so you're going to get to see that actual band shell. This is one of my favorite Laurel and Hardy films because at the beginning of the film, they have a home, they have jobs, they have a means of making a living, and gradually they lose all of these things during the course of the film, and they also lose much of their clothing, as you'll see. The one thing they don't lose is their friendship, and even though the Stan and Ollie friendship is a very difficult thing for both of them, it always endures. And I always say we don't laugh at Laurel and Hardy, we love them, and the reason we love them is because they love each other so much, which is an extra dimension to their humor. In the supporting cast, we have as the band leader a man named Otto Lederer. So when you come here on May 19th to see the jazz singer, you will see him very prominently in that film as the comedy relief character named Yudelson. There's an actress playing a landlady whose name was Agnes Steele. She was an Australian actress, and she was a friend of the director, who happened to be Edgar Kennedy. I don't know if many of you remember Edgar Kennedy. He was a comedy character man, and he was known for what he called the slow burn, where he would rub his face in anger, trying to suppress everything and keep it from boiling to the surface. So he was the director of this film. He doesn't appear in it, but he was the director. And there's also a young kid by the name of Monty O'Grady, who has the distinction of having appeared in the very earliest Our Gang films. He was a child actor. He did some feature films. This is his final movie. He was retiring from the movie industry at the age of 11. But he made enough films so that he could retire at the Motion Picture Country Home in Woodland Hills when he was in his later years. So here we go from 1928, Laurel and Hardy in "You're Darn Tootin'."